fog clung low to the cobblestones outside the University of London's Rare Manuscripts Library. Wrapping the grey morning in silence, a single constable stood on guard near the entrance. Nervously twisting his cap between his fingers, the gas lamps flickered as if uneasy, casting long shadows on the stone steps where Inspector Lestrade stood waiting impatient, sceptical and unsure whether to feel frustrated or curious. Inside, the crime scene was no less confounding. A reading room walled with ancient oak shelves stood eerily still, its tables deserted but for a single chair lying on its side. The smell of something burnt faint, acrid still lingered in the air. At the far end of the room, a fireplace crackled faintly. But it wasn't the warmth that drew attention, it was the scorched pile of ash within. "It was here," said Harold Finch, the library's assistant curator, his voice brittle with panic. "The only known copy of the Hexham Codex, 15th century. One of a kind." Holmes stood silently beside Lestrade, eyes narrowed, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He walked slowly to the hearth and knelt, running a gloved finger through the ash. "No pages left?" Holmes asked. "None," Finch replied. "Only that." He pointed. Near the fireplace lay a curious object, a heavy brass key, ornately engraved. With the letter M, it was clean to clean. Holmes picked it up, inspected it, and then examined the keyhole beneath the mantel. "Odd," he muttered. "It fits nothing here." Lestrade cleared his throat. "You called this an emergency, Holmes. We've got arson, certainly, but it's an old book, rare or not." "This hardly seems an old book," Holmes interrupted. "Inspector, the Hexham Codex contained marginal notes believed to predate the Rosetta Stone's decipherment. It's not just rare, it's irreplaceable. And I assure you, no bibliophile burns such a treasure by accident." He rose and turned sharply to Finch. Who else had access? Only the chief librarian, Mr. Bartholomew Pratt, and myself. But I found it like this. I opened the library this morning, and he was gone. His office is untouched, his coat still on the peg. The night guard said no one left the premises after midnight. A locked building, Holmes mused. No body, no witnesses, a fire with no accelerant, and a missing librarian. The three men walked briskly down a corridor toward Pratt's office. Finch opened the door with trembling hands. The office, curiously, felt almost too neat. A mug of cold tea sat on the desk, beside a folio opened to a catalogue entry, the Hexham Codex. Holmes stepped inside, then paused at the window. It was latched from within. No footprints below. He examined the desk, the bookshelves, and finally the waste bin. From within, he retrieved a half-burnt note. Only the bottom remained legible, too dangerous to let them find it. "If anyone asks, say it was never curious," Holmes said. "He didn't sign it." "Did what?" Lestrade asked. "Didn't finish it," Holmes said, as if he were interrupted. "But this fire was not the act of haste. The Codex burned completely. Someone stood and watched until every page was gone." Lestrade frowned. "So what do we have? A librarian vanishes overnight. A priceless manuscript is deliberately incinerated. And the only clue is a letter M on an unrelated key. And this note, Holmes added, folding the charred fragment carefully. Tell me, Mr. Finch, what was the codex about? Finch hesitated. It's a religious manuscript, but unusual. The margins contain ciphered symbols. Historians believe it may contain hidden references to the Temple of Mithras. Some even call it cursed. Cursed, Holmes repeated dryly. Finch flushed. I don't believe that, of course. But Pratty grew obsessed. He wouldn't let the codex be digitized. He even rejected an offer from the British Museum. Why? He said it had to be protected from them. And who did he mean by them? That's the thing. He never said. Holmes turned to leave, but stopped short. Where is the building's ledger? The logbook that records key entries, after-hours visitors, deliveries. In the front office. Lestrade fetched it. Holmes flipped through the pages swiftly. Nothing unusual for the last week until the night prior. A single entry at 11:47 p.m. Dr. Marlowe. Access granted by the Pratt. Finch gasped. Marlowe? But he died a year ago. Holmes didn't reply. He stared at the name for several seconds. Then he smiled faintly. Perhaps not quite as dead as we thought. Lestrade looked skeptical. So what now? Holmes turned toward the fireplace. Now, Inspector, we find out why a librarian pretended to vanish or was forced to, and who Marlowe really is. He pointed to the ash in the hearth again, and we start by confirming that what burned here was truly the codex at all. Holmes stood over the fireplace once more, his expression unreadable as the embers settled into silence. The room had emptied. Lestrade had gone to send for the night guard and a forensic chemist to analyze the ash. Finch lingered nervously near the door, fiddling with the brass key Holmes had returned to him. Holmes, however, seemed to hear something. Neither man could an invisible whisper buried in the char of a manuscript long thought sacred. Without looking away from the hearth, he spoke calmly. Mr. Finch, may I see the book catalogued again, the one that tracks what manuscripts were requested? By whom? And when? Finch nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with a thick leather ledger. Holmes turned the pages rapidly, his eyes scanning for a particular pattern. His finger tapped lightly near the bottom of an entry dated 3 days prior. Here, the codex was signed out by Pratt. As expected, Holmes murmured. But look at the next line. Finch leaned in. Manuscript Room E-Book ID 924. That's Historia Mithrae, Volume 2. But that's restricted. Restricted, Holmes repeated. And yet it was pulled from the vault. By Pratt? Finch asked. No, Holmes said, tapping the initials. Signed out by R.S. Finch paled. Rebecca Slade. She's our junior archivist. Barely 2 months into her post. She shouldn't even know the vault exists. Holmes closed the ledger and stood. Find her. As Finch darted off down the corridor, Holmes remained perfectly still, eyes closed. A whisper of wind from the chimney touched his face, and then a scent. Not paper, not ash. Something acrid and metallic, like scorched wax. He looked up, scanning the bricks of the fireplace until something caught the light, faint but deliberate. A smudge. Holmes leaned in, drew a handkerchief from his coat, and pressed it gently against the brick. When he pulled back, a faint impression of ink lines appeared. Letters, not fully visible, but just enough. M therefore R therefore Freemasonry, or something that wished to evoke it. Footsteps returned, quick and uneven. Finch reappeared, breathless. She's not here. No one's seen her since last night. Her coat's still in the cloakroom, but she hasn't clocked in today. Holmes nodded slowly, then picked up the brass key again. He weighed it in his palm, then placed it against the spines of the books surrounding the hearth, brushing gently against the bindings as he moved down the row. Then he stopped. One book sat farther back than the others. It was older, dustier, less touched. Holmes pulled it free. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, he said softly. The Catholic Church's banned books list. Curious placement for a volume of censorship. He held the brass key against the spine. A shallow groove ran vertically, just wide enough to hold the key's edge. Sliding it along the groove, Holmes heard a click. The back of the shelf shifted slightly, a hidden panel. Finch gasped. I didn't know that existed. Neither did Pratt, I suspect. But someone did. Inside was a narrow compartment, empty. Dust undisturbed save for a square-shaped patch where something had recently rested. Holmes measured it with his eyes, roughly the size of a folio. He muttered, perhaps even the codex itself. So it wasn't burned? Finch asked. Hard to say, but I'm increasingly confident the ash in that hearth came from a substitute, a forgery, perhaps prepared in advance. Finch exhaled sharply. Then Pratt is either in hiding or has been taken. Holmes finished. Behind them, the main door creaked open. Lestrade returned with the night guard in tow, a stocky man with a heavy brow and sleep-clouded eyes. Name's Lyle. Lestrade offered. Says no one came or went after midnight. Confirms Pratt locked the archive at 10:15 p.m. and hadn't come back down by 2. When Lyle's shift ended, Holmes turned to the guard. Did you see Miss Slade? Slade? Sure. She left about an hour after Pratt went upstairs. Said she had a headache. Carriage picked her up. Described the driver. Lyle shrugged. Didn't get a look. Fog was thick. Could have been anyone. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Anyone, he echoed. Lestrade frowned. Why go through all this trouble? If it was just theft, why burn a fake? Because it isn't just theft, Holmes said. It's misdirection. He motioned for Lestrade to follow and led him briskly to the building's side entrance, seldom used. Except for receiving shipments, Holmes crouched near the doors frame, brushing his finger along the threshold. See here, he said, scorch marks and wax residue. Someone melted a seal here recently, possibly to bypass the lock without breaking it. Lestrade whistled low. That'd take skill. Or a key, Holmes replied. Perhaps this one. He held up the brass key again. It glinted softly in the morning light. Lestrade looked skeptical. So let me guess, this Dr. Marlowe either forged the burn, abducted Pratt, coerced Miss Slade, and escaped through the back door without leaving a trace. Something like that, Holmes said. But I don't believe Miss Slade was coerced. Not yet. She's in on it. She knew more than she let on. She accessed restricted texts under false initials. She was the last to leave before the codex vanished. And if she was picked up by carriage, Holmes added, then someone expected her. Could be coincidence. Could be, Holmes said softly, but his eyes were already elsewhere. But coincidences rarely bring brass keys and false identities. Finch reappeared, holding a telegram. This just arrived, he said, voice shaken. It's from Miss Slade's landlord. He says her rooms were emptied last night, left in a hurry. No forwarding address. Holmes nodded slowly, as though this merely confirmed what he already knew. Then, with quiet deliberation, he turned and strode back into the reading room, pausing once more before the now cold hearth. Marlowe was not a ghost, he said. He was an alias. For who? Lestrade asked. I don't yet know, Holmes said. But we'll begin with Rebecca Slade's past. He held the scorched note up to the light once more. If anyone asks, say it was never. He didn't finish the sentence aloud, but in his mind he heard the rest. Never here. Never real. Never found. By midday, the fog had lifted, replaced by a bruised grey sky and a cold wind that tugged at the edges of coats and tempers alike. Holmes, never one to lose momentum when the scent of deceit lingered, sat comfortably in the library's administration chamber, an austere room with frosted windows, polished mahogany furniture, and a grandfather clock that ticked like a soft, constant accusation. Inspector Lestrade had arranged for 3 interviews. One by one, the potential witnesses filed in, each wearing a different mask of concern. The first to enter was Eleanor Hargrove, head of the manuscripts division. She was in her late 50s, with a severe bun and a voice honed by decades of shushing. Whispering scholars, her eyes hard, intelligent, gave the impression that nothing escaped her notice. I warned Bartholomew, she said, hands folded tightly in her lap. That book was dangerous. Not cursed, mind you, but controversial. The academic interest it drew was obsessive. Holmes gave a courteous nod. And when did you last see Mr. Pratt? 2 days ago. He'd taken to sleeping in his office. On and off claimed it was to protect the codex, though I suspect it was more to avoid his flatmates. He was paranoid, yes, but not without reason. We'd had break-in attempts before, unsophisticated ones, and Miss Slade, Holmes asked. Hargrove hesitated, her voice turning cautious. Bright girl. To bright, perhaps. Bartholomew took a liking to her, mentored her, gave her unusual access. I questioned it more than once. You disapproved. I disapproved of secrecy, she replied firmly. He stopped logging late-night research. Sometimes I'd arrive to find manuscripts out of order, drawers half open, things just wrong. Slade always seemed to be nearby. Holmes tilted his head. Do you believe she was manipulating him? I believe she was not what she seemed. Holmes thanked her and made a subtle note as she left. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. She's confident. She's too confident, Holmes murmured. Her timeline overlaps with Finch's, but her sense of detail is sharper. She remembers what others might forget or pretend to. The next visitor was Robert Tilley, the night porter for the West Wing Archives. His shift had ended just before the incident, and his demeanor was all nervous energy, shifting eyes, fingers tapping his trousers. A twitching lip didn't hear nothing unusual. "Sir," he said quickly, "did me rounds, same as always. You work the same shift as Lyle, alternate nights?" Tilly replied. "I did Wednesday. He did Thursday. That means the last time I saw Pratt was Tuesday night, I suppose. Did you speak?" He gave me a nod, was carrying a stack of folders, looked dead tired. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Folders? The Codex is a bound folio. What sort of folders?" Tilly hesitated, didn't see too clearly. "Just manila things. Could have been notes." But he walked toward the rare room, not the reading tables. I thought it strange. Holmes leaned back. "And Miss Slade, did she speak to you?" "She asked for directions," Tilly replied, "to the east stairs. Said she was looking for some old storage. I gave her the key, well, a copy I carry, for errands. She never returned it." Holmes and Lestrade exchanged a glance. "You reported that?" "I didn't think much of it. Keys go missing all the time. Not one's tied to restricted sections." Holmes said gently. Tilly looked pale. "You don't think she?" "I think you're telling the truth," Holmes said, studying him. "But not the whole of it. I don't know anything else. I swear, perhaps. But even lies come dressed in silence." The porter left quickly, eager to be gone. Lestrade exhaled loudly. "He's hiding something." "Yes, but it's not guilt. It's fear," Holmes replied. "Someone warned him to forget." The final interview was with Harold Finch, who returned looking more composed than he had earlier. Still, Holmes noticed the faint tremor in his hand when he accepted a glass of water. "You worked with Miss Slade closely," Holmes began. "Yes," Finch said. "She was assigned to me for training. Brilliant, intuitive, perhaps too ambitious." "You're not the first to say so," Holmes said. "But you didn't mention knowing she accessed the Mithras texts." Finch blinked. "Because I didn't. No, I swear it." Holmes paused. "And yet you knew she wasn't allowed to." Finch flushed. "Well, yes, but that's standard policy." "You never saw her in the vault?" Finch hesitated. "Once. Maybe. I assumed she had permission." "You didn't ask?" "No. I didn't want to seem suspicious." Holmes regarded him carefully. "Or you didn't want her to ask you questions?" Finch's voice dropped. "Look, I'm not proud of it. She intimidated me. All right? Always seemed to steps ahead, like she was watching everyone. I just tried to stay out of her way. And yet," Holmes said, "you were the first to report the Codex missing. You opened the library, found the scene, called the police." "Yes, because it was gone. The ash, the smell, the chair overturned." Holmes raised a finger. "Yes, all elements of a scene meant to be discovered, Mr. Finch. Someone wanted you to find it first. You were chosen." Finch stared at him. "You think this was staged for me?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Did Miss Slade ever mention the name Marlowe to you?" Finch looked confused. "No. Should she have?" Holmes watched him a moment longer. "Thank you. That will be all for now." When Finch had gone, Lestrade leaned in. "They're all pointing fingers, but nothing sticks." Holmes didn't respond. He walked to the window, gazing out toward the rooftops, the clouds above heavy and unmoving. "They each speak fragments of truth," he said at last. "But the lie is collective. A deception shared, perhaps, unknowingly by all of them." Lestrade frowned. Shared Bellinor guards the rules, but failed to notice when they were broken. Tilly gave access without question. Finch looked away, hoping not to be involved. And somewhere in the middle, Rebecca Slade moved freely through their blind spots. He turned back, the intensity in his voice rising just slightly. "She is not missing. She is waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For us," Holmes said, "to follow the wrong trail." Outside, the rain had started a soft, steady drizzle that tapped against the library's leaded windows. Like a quiet metronome to Holmes's thoughts, he sat in Bartholomew Pratt's vacant office. The chair turned slightly to face the hearth as though its former occupant might return at any moment. Lestrade stood by the desk, leafing through a small stack of paper that had been pulled from the drawer. "Letters from the British Museum," Lestrade muttered. "They offered to purchase the codex twice in the last 6 months. Pratt refused. Said it wasn't for sale." Holmes didn't turn. Because it wasn't his to sell, or he no longer believed it safe to release. Then why stay? Why protect it if it was already drawing danger? Holmes stood, slowly, because Pratt believed in something. Perhaps not the codex itself, but in what it concealed. Lestrade glanced over. "You're saying the book was a smokescreen? Perhaps a decoy," Holmes said. "Or perhaps a gate." The metaphor hung in the air, and Holmes tapped lightly on the armrest of the chair. "Let's revisit what we know. Pratt had motive to hide the codex not out of greed, but belief. Finch had proximity, but lacked courage. Hargrove feared controversy, and Slade." He paused, drawing out her name like a thread being tugged from a tangled weave. "Slade had access, intelligence, and ambition. But ambition alone doesn't lead one to fake a burning and vanish." Lestrade folded his arms. "Could be money. Someone else bought her off. Possible. But who profits?" Holmes moved toward the desk and laid the brass key down. "Consider this instead. What if the motive wasn't personal gain but prevention? What if Slade and Pratt believed that what was hidden inside the codex, or behind it, posed a threat?" Lestrade frowned. "You're suggesting they were on the same side." "Unlikely," Holmes said. "But they may have arrived at the same conclusion from different paths." There was a knock at the door. A constable entered with a wet envelope. "This just came for Inspector Lestrade. Delivered by hand. No return address." Lestrade took it, broke the seal, and pulled out a folded note. His brow furrowed as he read aloud. "To meddle in forgotten truths is to inherit forgotten consequences. Leave the ashes be." No signature. Holmes extended a hand for the envelope. He examined the flap, the paper grain, and then sniffed it. Once, parchment, handmade, ink, iron gall unusual for a casual fret. He held the letter up to the light. Watermark. Prison. Sold only at Charpentier's on Rue de la Harpe. Lestrade blinked. "You know the stationers? They make Holmes' family Christmas paper," Holmes said absently. Then he looked up. "This isn't the first letter." Lestrade followed his gaze. "You think Pratt received one too? I bet on it." Holmes returned to the wastebasket where the half-burnt note had been, discovered and began carefully, removing the crumpled remains still buried beneath yesterday's tea leaves. Another fragment, this one nearly whole, showed part of a torn envelope corner, with a wax seal faintly smudged. The seal matched the mark in the ash behind the fireplace. M therefore Lestrade looked grim. So this MMR, whoever or whatever they are, they're watching us. Holmes turned, his voice calm but clipped. "They're not watching us, Inspector." "They were watching her, Miss Slade." He straightened, setting the note down with care. "We need to know more about her. Not the library's version, the real version." Within the hour, they stood inside the small flat in Southwark Miss Slade had once called home. The landlord had granted them access with a shrug. Left in a hurry, she did. Rent paid till month's end. The room was Spartan, but neat. A suitcase still sat on the bed, half-packed, as if abandoned in haste. But Holmes saw differently. He moved directly to the nightstand drawer. "A false exit," he muttered, pulling it open. Inside were 3 carefully cut news clippings and a small journal. The clippings referenced a dig in Anatolia, a conference on suppressed religious cults, and an obituary. Bartholomew Pratt's brother. Died 5 years prior. Antiquarian. Specialist in Mithraic temples. Holmes opened the journal. The writing inside was brisk, angular, methodical. The codex is not literal. The folio sequence encodes cardinal alignments reference to a structure, possibly subterranean. Pratt suspects, but he won't risk sharing the final cipher. I've narrowed the location to 3 possibilities beneath the city. Must act before the Foundation reclaims it. He read aloud, slowly, and then turned to Lestrade. Slade wasn't here for a job. She was here for a hunt. The codex was a map, not a manuscript. And Pratt, he may have been the last thing standing between her and what she sought. Lestrade's face tightened. But if they were both chasing it, what went wrong? Holmes closed the journal. Pratt wanted to protect it. She wanted to find it. Back at the library, Eleanor Hargrove was waiting with arms crossed and lips pursed. "You should know," she said. "Finch has gone. Left a note on his desk, claimed a family emergency." Lestrade swore softly. "Another one vanishes." Holmes stared past her. "No," he said. "Finch doesn't have the courage to vanish. He's being silenced, one thread at a time." Hargrove's expression darkened. "I told you this codex was dangerous." Holmes turned sharply. "You knew." "I suspected," she said, voice suddenly low. "Years ago, when Pratt's brother died, Bartholomew became obsessed with sealing the vault. He stopped sharing research. He said there were forces older than our methods of truth. Why didn't you say so earlier?" "Because I thought it was madness," she said simply. "Until now." Holmes turned to leave. "Inspector, we need access to the subcellars. There's a passage beneath the east wing, the old Roman tunnels. If she's looking for something buried, it won't be in the archives. Lestrade nodded. "I'll get torches." As they left the room, Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself. Slade chased knowledge. Pratt feared it. And someone watching from the dark knows that the truth has already begun to wake. The subcellars beneath the universities. East Wing exhaled a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The air was still, but felt heavy, as though steeped in centuries of whispered oaths and long-buried secrets. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting flickering light across the ancient stonework as Lestrade and a constable followed. Damp walls ran with thin rivulets, and patches of Roman brick still peeked through the mortar remnants of a forgotten civilization preserved beneath modern scholarship. Holmes had memorized the Codex's folio sequence from the reproduction notes, which he'd secretly copied earlier from Pratt's office. Each entry had been numbered oddly, not in chronological order, but in compass degrees 27, 118, 247, and so on, turning those numbers into a crude directional map. He'd plotted them over the library's original foundation plan. They pointed irregularly, but undeniably toward the eastern tunnel cluster, where undocumented renovations had sealed certain passages off decades ago. There, he said, stopping at a dead end where a rusted gate barred entry to a forgotten alcove. He brushed away dust from a stone relief depicting a lion devouring a snake, and pressed along the bottom. A faint click echoed. A hidden latch gave way. The gate opened inward with a groan. Inside, the room was empty. Cracked walls, broken stone. Nothing else. Holmes moved in, his expression unreadable. Lestrade followed with a sigh. Another dead end. Then Holmes said nothing. His eyes swept the floor. Dust had been disturbed. Not recently, but not ancient either. He knelt and examined a faint trail, fine scratches, almost like a dragged box. He followed it to the far wall, where a stone slab had once stood upright but now leaned at an angle. Then he saw it, a cloth fragment caught on the jagged edge of the slab. Deep green, threaded with gold. "Library colors, Slade," Holmes whispered, "or Pratt." He reached beneath the slab band. His fingers found metal. He pulled it free. A safe. Box, heavy, scratched, and locked. Back upstairs, the safe was placed in the library's reading room. Lestrade called in a locksmith, who worked quickly under the growing weight of expectation. Holmes watched quietly, eyes narrowed not at the box, but at the reactions round it. Eleanor Hargrove stood ramrod straight, as if bracing for a ghost. The constables were whispering. Even Finch, who had reappeared an hour earlier after a brief visit home, now hovered behind them, wringing his hands. Holmes said nothing about his sudden return. Not yet. The safe clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilskin and cloth, lay the hexam Codex. Intact. The room froze. Lestrade clapped a hand on Holmes's shoulder, beaming. "Well done, Holmes. You've done it. The real Codex. We'll have it examined. But that seal look. It's Pratt's mark. He must have hidden it before. Whatever happened?" Even Finch looked dumbfounded. I didn't know he had another safe." Holmes picked up the book gently, inspecting the cover. It was indeed the original binding goatskin, hand-stamped. In Latin, bearing the twin lions' crest associated with the early Vatican library. The pages, yellowed and brittle, matched the descriptions in the archival records. He flipped to the first ciphered page. It was blank. A second page blank. Then another. Each folio had been carefully erased. The margins were intact. The inked cipher gone. Holmes closed the book slowly. "No," he said at last. "This isn't a victory." Lestrade turned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this codex has been washed. The marginalia is gone, precisely, surgically removed." "You mean it's a fake?" "No," Holmes said. "It's worse. It's real, but its meaning has been erased." Finch paled. "But why would someone do that?" "To make it safe," Holmes replied. "Or to render it useless." "Pratt?" Hargrove asked. Holmes shook his head. "He'd have destroyed it, not silenced it." Lestrade gestured. "Still, we've recovered the original. Surely that settles the theft." "No," Holmes said sharply, "because this book was never meant to be found." He held up the cloth wrapping. Green and gold, torn in exactly the place he'd seen in the tunnel. "This was staged," he said, carefully, deliberately. "Whoever placed this safe box wanted us to find it now. After we'd already concluded the codex was destroyed, after Slade had vanished." Lestrade frowned. "But what's the purpose? To create closure," Holmes said. "A convenient one. This," he gestured to the book, "is a tombstone. It says, 'Stop looking. It's over.' And you think the real culprit is still out there." "I know it." Just then, a runner burst through the main doors with a telegram. Urgent came from Mr. Finch. Finch turned sharply. "Me?" He opened it with trembling fingers. His face went ashen. Holmes stepped forward. "What does it say?" Finch swallowed. "It's from my sister, Rebecca." Lestrade blinked. "Your sister? She changed her name when she applied here. Said she didn't want to be accused of nepotism." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And you didn't think to mention this before?" "She told me not to." "She said it was safer that way." Lestrade snapped. "Safer from whom?" Finch didn't answer. Instead, he handed Holmes the note, scrawled in hurried ink. "They know I'm close. Don't trust the silence. Meet me where the lion devours the sun." Holmes stared at it for several seconds. "She's alive." Lestrade leaned in. "What does it mean?" Holmes didn't reply immediately. He turned the telegram over, checking the watermark French parchment again. Then he looked up, his voice low. "It means this codex wasn't the end. It was a warning." Outside, the drizzle had become a downpour. But inside, Sherlock Holmes could feel the heat rising not from fire, but from something older. The real puzzle had just begun to move. Holmes stood with the telegram still in his hand, his expression unreadable. Outside, thunder growled low over London like some slumbering beast disturbed by prophecy. The messages, final phrase where the lion devours the sun swirled in his thoughts, a symbolic riddle cloaked in myth and memory. The codex was not the climax, only the first veil pulled aside. "I need everything you can find on Mithraic iconography," he said abruptly, turning to Lestrade. "Specifically London-based temples. Known altars, carvings, anything. Lestrade blinked. Now, Holmes said, before the next page is torn away. Lestrade gave a short nod and left. Holmes turned slowly to Finch, whose hands still trembled from the shock. "She's not just your sister, Mr. Finch," Holmes said coldly. "She's also your accomplice, whether willingly or not." Finch looked wounded. "No, I swear I didn't help her with anything. I didn't even know what she was doing with the codex. But you knew she had an agenda," Holmes interrupted. "You stayed silent when she requested vault access under false initials. You let her manipulate Pratt. You saw the shift in her, felt it, even. And still, you said nothing. I thought she was just ambitious, brilliant, even. She wanted to be the one who discovered its secrets. I thought Pratt was holding her back unfairly." Holmes's gaze was like frost. "And now he's vanished," Finch faltered. "I never imagined it would go this far." Holmes turned away without a word and walked toward the library's archive annex. There, he descended into the records vault, another dim corridor of shadowed whispers and forgotten paper. He moved with precision, as if guided by instinct rather than light. After 15 minutes of scanning, he paused at a shelf marked Municipal Excavations, 1881 to 1890. He drew a dusty binder free. Inside, brittle newsprint and typed city records lay folded in tight bundles. One caught his attention. Immediately, foundations. Interrupted by temple ruins Mithraic symbols discovered near Blackfriars Bridge, Holmes read on. The article detailed how a planned expansion of a subterranean tunnel had been halted when workers uncovered the remains of a Mithraean columns, ritual basins, an altar. One fragment in particular stood out, a carving of a lion devouring a radiant disk, presumed to be the sun. The temple had been resealed, and the location, under the former Charterhouse crypt, near Ludgate. He closed the folder and returned upstairs at once. By the time Lestrade arrived, Holmes was already lacing his boots. "We're going underground again," Holmes said. "Near Ludgate Hill." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Why there?" "Because that's where the trail started." They reached the entrance to the long-forgotten crypt just before sunset. The surrounding buildings had changed, but the undercroft remained locked in time-sealed door behind a disused church, half swallowed by ivy and soot. Holmes pried it open with a crowbar, and together they stepped into darkness. The air was thick and ancient. The descent was narrow, carved stone slick with condensation. Moss crept between cracks, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water from above. They reached a chamber lined with broken columns and a sunken floor. At its center stood an altar, low and cracked, its face carved with the lion and sun motif. A half-burnt candle rested on its edge. Footprints once set led away into a corridor. "Someone's been here," Lestrade murmured. "Recently," Holmes agreed, and alone, they followed the footprints. The tunnel curved sharply left, then opened into a circular vault, and they half-seated against the wall. Weak but breathing was Bartholomew Pratt. His face was gaunt, his coat damp with cold sweat. A bandage wrapped his forearm. The moment he saw Holmes, his eyes widened. "You came," he rasped. "Thank God." Holmes knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "How long have you been down here?" "3 days," Pratt whispered. "Since I switched the codex. I couldn't risk letting her get the real cipher. Slade." He nodded slowly. "She wasn't alone. There's a group. Old names. Hidden. She said they fund recoveries. But it's theft, suppression, control." Holmes glanced at Lestrade. "Did she threaten you?" "No," Pratt said bitterly. "She offered to help. Said we were kindred minds. I believed her until she asked for the cipher, the one encoded in the annotations, and you refused. I told her I'd burned it. I hadn't. I brought it here, hid it in the altar. She realized too late." Holmes stood and crossed the chamber. He examined the altar, then pressed along its carved surface. A shallow groove hidden in the lion's mane clicked. The stone lid creaked open to reveal a small scroll, tightly wound, sealed with the same mark from the fireplace ash. M, therefore R, therefore Holmes held it up. She was looking for this. As they prepared to leave, Pratt staggered to his feet, supported by Lestrade. "She's not gone," Pratt muttered. "She's not hiding. She's waiting." Holmes met his gaze. "And she's not alone." They emerged into the city's dimming dusk, the cathedral bells tolling from afar. Behind them, the crypt sealed again, its secrets momentarily contained. But as Holmes pocketed the scroll, his fingers closed around something cold, an ancient dot. This wasn't a theft. It was a retrieval, and the hand reaching for it was far older than Rebecca Slade. The following morning dawned with a smothering stillness. London's skyline lay under a veil of thick fog. The streets hushed as if the city itself held its breath. In the warmth of 221B Baker Street, the retrieved scroll now sat sealed within a bell jar, resting on Holmes's desk beside an array of instruments, magnifiers, chemical agents, wax transfer sheets. Holmes had not slept. Lestrade had gone to arrange secure transport for Pratt and had taken the fragile man to a clinic for proper treatment. But Holmes had declined rest, something in the night air, in the weight of the scroll and the strange order that had orchestrated its concealment, pulled his mind into relentless motion. He was certain of 3 things. The cipher encoded within the codex's marginalia had not yet been fully revealed. Pratt had not fabricated his fear, and Rebecca Slade had not vanished. She had merely changed her angle of approach. She was still in London, and now she would know that the scroll had been found. It was time to draw her out. At precisely 11 a.m., Holmes requested Lestrade to arrange an informal gathering in the library's East Reading room, ostensibly to thank staff for their cooperation in resolving the theft. Finch, Hargrove, and a few senior archivists were summoned. Tea was served. Holmes made no mention of the recovered scroll, nor did he reference the cipher. Instead, he announced a public donation, a facsimile edition of the Hexham Codex, compiled and reconstructed from Pratt's surviving notes and confirmed by Holmes himself. Lestrade looked puzzled, but Holmes gave no explanation. "I'd like to unveil it here, with all of you present," Holmes said. "We've created a simplified edition, of course, minus any dangerous material. Just the visible structure of the codex bindings. script, and known annotations. Nothing sensitive. He unwrapped a leather-bound folio from a cloth satchel and placed it carefully on the table. The resemblance to the true codex was uncanny, but more importantly, every suspect in the room now believed it held value. They leaned closer. Hargrave's eyes narrowed. Finch stood behind her, fidgeting. The others murmured. Lestrade, playing along, poured tea with studied indifference. Holmes casually reached into his pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This," he said, "contains a full translation of the cipher Pratt originally protected. We found it with him hidden, but untouched. I've made copies. One will be given to the British Museum, another to the Vatican Archive." There was silence. Even the teacups were still. Then Holmes said, quite cheerfully, "I only regret Miss Slade could not be here. I suspect she would have found the translation illuminating." A single spoon clinked gently against porcelain. Finch had dropped it. Holmes glanced at him. "Is something the matter, Mr. Finch?" Finch smiled weakly. "Just a bit clumsy." Holmes nodded. "Understandable. You've been through a great deal." He turned to Hargrove. "Miss Hargrove, I'm told you once studied cryptography at King's College. Do you recognize this glyph?" He drew a symbol on the page, a stylized lion's head surrounded by radial lines. She studied it for a moment. "No, though it resembles solar worship iconography, perhaps adapted." Holmes nodded. "Interesting. You see, it was burned into the parchment's wax, which means it wasn't just a symbol. It was a signature." He paused. "But that's not what intrigues me. What intrigues me is that only two people in this room have handled the original codex after its so-called destruction." Silence again. Lestrade looked up sharply. Holmes leaned in. "Mr. Finch, when we found the recovered codex, you claimed surprise, genuine surprise. Yet just now, when I mentioned the cipher, your face didn't react at all. Not to shock, not to relief, almost as if you'd already read it." Finch paled. "That's absurd." Holmes cut him off. "No. What's absurd is that you expected your sister to return. She contacted you first, and despite claiming ignorance, you knew more than anyone about the codex's history. You played the coward, Mr. Finch. But cowards don't forge telegrams." The room exploded with noise. Hargrove gasped. Lestrade surged forward. But Holmes raised a hand. "Let him speak." Finch's face was bloodless. "I didn't forge anything." Holmes walked slowly toward him, voice low but sharp. "The telegram you received wasn't from Rebecca. It bore the same watermark as the others, but you told us that she had sent it. A lie. You used it to direct us toward the crypt. Why? Because you knew Pratt had hidden the scroll there. You weren't trying to find him, you were trying to make sure we found him first, before she did." Finch's mouth opened, then closed. Holmes stepped closer. "You betrayed her." A pause. Then a slow, bitter breath. Finch looked down. "She changed," he whispered. "It started in Anatolia. She found something in one of the temple ruins. Not the codex, but something older. Symbols, names. She came back speaking about lines of succession, hidden orders. She said the codex wasn't just about Mithras, it was about preservation. Something tied to bloodlines, prophecy. Hargrove shook her head in disbelief. She made me swear not to interfere. But when Pratt disappeared, and she sent me that second note, she wasn't warning me. She was warning them. are the group. She's not afraid of them. She is them. Holmes nodded. Quietly. So you staged the letter, lured us to the scroll, so that we, not she, would take possession of it first. Finch looked up, eyes shining. I didn't want her to win. Holmes stared into his face. Then, with deliberate care, he picked up the envelope on the table, the one he had claimed contained the cipher, and tore it open. Inside was a blank sheet. Lestrade blinked. It was bait, Holmes said. No translation exists yet, but the reaction told me everything. Finch collapsed into the chair, as if a weight had finally snapped his spine. She'll come for it. You know that, don't you? Holmes said nothing. He turned his eyes toward the window, where the grey sky had begun to break. A narrow shaft of sunlight poured down through the fog, catching the lion emblem embossed on the Fox Codex's cover. Somewhere, in the maze of London's alleys and shadows, Rebecca Slade was still moving, strategic, calm, watching. She wasn't finished, not yet. The rain had returned by nightfall, this time with a quiet persistence that mirrored Holmes's mood. The scroll, now carefully unsealed, had begun to reveal its secrets under controlled laboratory light, symbolic notations overlaying cardinal diagrams, interspersed with fragments of ancient Latin and pre-Roman glyphs. Each mark was measured, symmetrical, precise, whatever it signified. It was no fevered mysticism. It was a code. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden, or perhaps to keep it safe. The cipher lay on Holmes's desk at 2 to 1B, beside a series of notes he had transcribed through the night. Lestrade had ordered protective custody placed around Finch, though the man barely spoke now. He had admitted enough to confirm Rebecca's radicalization and her obsession with uncovering not just the Codex's contents, but the ancient structure she believed lay beneath London, a sanctuary tied to forgotten rites. Its location preserved through veiled symbols passed down through centuries. But it was no longer just about knowledge or power. Someone else had joined the game. Someone pulling threads from the shadows, intercepting letters, forging messages, and now perhaps watching every move Holmes made. At precisely 1 in the morning, Holmes placed the cipher under a locked cabinet, set the alarmed mechanism in place, and retired upstairs with a single candle. Sleep did not come. Instead, he sat at the window, eyes fixed on the haze-soaked street, tapping a finger against his teacup as the rain softened the world into silence. When he descended just after dawn, he noticed it immediately, the faint scent of oil, not candle wax, metal oil. He crossed the sitting room in 3 long strides and opened the cabinet. The scroll was gone. The cabinet had not been forced. The lock was intact. The mechanism had been disarmed using the correct sequence. No scratches, no forced entries. Whoever had done this had known exactly how to bypass the system, either through precise observation or prior access. Holmes stood motionless for half a minute. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock, Then he turned toward the window again. The pane bore a small, circular smudge near the latch dot. He opened it. Outside, on the ledge, a faint footprint in ash or soot, a rope mark trailing down into the alley. They hadn't come through the door. They'd come from above. He left at once, coat and scarf thrown over his shoulder, and made directly for Scotland Yard. Lestrade was already there, summoned early by news that would hit both of them harder than expected. "I was going to call you," Lestrade said, eyes grim. "The safe at the Yard Pratt's scroll. The copy you had sent over yesterday. For record. It's gone." Holmes froze. Lestrade rubbed his brow. "To guards on duty. Both claim nothing was touched, but the storage box is empty." Holmes nodded once, as if a theory had just received its final proof. "Then we were never alone." Lestrade looked at him. "Inside the Yard. Inside everything." Holmes replied. "Finch, Hargrove, perhaps even Pratt. At one time, Slade played them all. But she's not the one moving now. She would never have taken both the original and the copy. She would have left one to mislead us." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Then who? Who benefits from silence?" Holmes asked. "Not theft, not power, but erasure. Someone who wants the Codex myth to die out entirely. Someone who considers both Pratt and Slade expendable." Lestrade looked rattled. "You're talking about NMR. I believe we've only seen its edges," Holmes said. "But they're not only watching, they're intervening." Holmes requested a private examination of the guard logs for the past 48 hours' arrivals, shifts, names, and cross-referenced each one against employment records and service gaps. One stood out: Merrick Adley, custodial assistant, transferred quietly to months ago from archives. Never requested leave. No disciplinary record. But one curious footnote in his file: a summer spent as a linguistic intern at the Vatican Shadow Repository. "Find him," Holmes said. But Adley was already gone. Back at the library, Holmes made his way into the Eastern Archive levels, past the corridor where the Fox Codex had been discovered. He traced the path again, this time paying closer attention to the ceiling beams, the grates, the forgotten vents and stone ducts running above and behind the bookshelves. A network of crawl spaces and maintenance tunnels, some going as far back as the 1600s, an unseen highway. He returned to Pratt's office, empty now, files cleared. Yet one cabinet, locked at the bottom, had not been opened by the police during the original sweep. The librarian's key retrieved days earlier still. Matched. Inside, letters, hundreds, mostly mundane correspondence. But one bundle marked with the now familiar Lion and Son seal bore parchment thicker than the rest. Holmes removed the top one. It was addressed to a man named Tobias Wren. An antiquities dealer in Cairo. Familiar. The message was succinct. "The scroll is nearing the convergence. The bearer must not reach the axis. Delay if necessary. The lesser fire is preferable to the greater awakening." Holmes read it twice, then placed it in his pocket. He knew the phrase axis. It had appeared on the cipher in fragmented Latin. "Ubi axis dormit, lux orata ex tenebri." Where the axis sleeps, Light rises from darkness. It wasn't metaphor. It was a location. And someone was still trying to bury it. When he returned to Baker Street that night, Holmes found a note slipped beneath the door. Handwritten, clean, ink barely dry. Your reach has exceeded your understanding. The scroll was a door, not the destination. Let the dead cities rest, or you will join them. No signature, but the smell of metal oil still lingered faintly along its edge. Not from a pen, from a glove. Holmes stared at it in silence. Then he placed the note beside the others and turned toward the empty space where the scroll had once sat. Someone had stolen it. Someone else had burned the trail behind. And the final move had not yet been played. By the following evening, the rhythm of the case had shifted into a tense stillness, a deceptive calm. Before some inevitable breaking point, Holmes, usually tireless in the face of mystery, had grown quieter, his focus narrower. The theft of the scroll and the note that followed it had confirmed what he already feared. This was no longer about the Hexham Codex. It had become a game of containment, of misdirection and sacrifice. Whoever had taken the scroll hadn't done so out of greed or curiosity, but out of fear of what it pointed to. Yet Holmes had something left. Not the scroll, not the cipher, but a location. The phrase on the Vatican letter had mentioned the convergence, and the fragmented Latin from the Codex had named the axis, the sleeping point beneath the city where darkness turned to light. He believed he knew where that axis lay, Ludgate. Hill again, but deeper, beneath even the Mithraic temple, beneath the sealed Roman aqueduct that had once run toward what was now the old crypt. Under King's Reach, the Romans had left clues in stone and water. The church had layered its own symbols above. Holmes had seen them on old maps, in forgotten charters. Etched into stained glass fragments the museum thought were purely decorative. At 9:30, just as he prepared to set out, Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway holding a telegram. "Delivered just now," she said, puzzled. "No return address, but it's been paid in full. Handwritten, too." Holmes took the slip and opened it. There were only 2 words. "She's gone." No signature, no punctuation. But Holmes recognized the careful penmanship, the deliberate slant of the G. It was Bartholomew Pratt's hand. Within 10 minutes, Holmes had arrived at the clinic in Lambeth where Pratt had been recovering under light guard. The nurse's station was silent, dimly lit. The receptionist blinked up in surprise as Holmes entered. "Mr. Holmes, you're here for Dr. Pratt. I assume." "Yes." "Where is he?" The woman hesitated. "He signed himself out less than an hour ago. Said he'd received clearance from Scotland Yard. Showed us identification. 2 officers escorted him." Holmes froze. "Do you still have their names?" Yes. They signed the exit log. But I can't read them clearly." Holmes took the clipboard from her, scanned the page, and frowned. The signatures were neat but meaningless. No proper badge numbers. Just names. Merrick Adley and T. Wren. The blood drained from his face. He turned without a word and headed toward the stairs just as Lestrade came bursting in. Through the front door, breathless and flushed. "They've found a body," he said. Holmes Stopped. Where? The River Fleet, just below Blackfriars, pulled from the sluice gate. Holmes's voice dropped. Is it her? Lestrade didn't answer. Instead, he handed over a soaked photograph. It was grainy, taken by a constable's lantern light. The body lay half-curled in the mud, her face turned slightly, a bruise along one temple. Rebecca Slade, or what was left of her. Holmes stared at the image for a long time. How long has she been dead? They estimate less than 3 hours. He calculated the timing. Then she was alive when the scroll was stolen. Lestrade nodded grimly. And now she's not. They rode to the scene in silence. The body had already been moved to the coroner's cart, but the site remained cordoned. Holmes ignored the murmurs of uniformed men and crouched by the water's edge, scanning the wall above. Moss disturbed here, he muttered. No scuff marks, but a trail of algae. Faint drag lines. She didn't fall, she was placed. He stood slowly. She knew something, or found something. Something too dangerous to be left alive with. Lestrade cleared his throat. There's more. Pratt's gone missing. The officers who escorted him fake. Probably the same to names you've flagged. And Finch's safe house? Empty. Windows smashed from inside. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So the circle is closing. They returned to Baker Street well past midnight. The fireplace was cold, the flat dark save for a single lamp Holmes had left on. Yet, as he stepped through the door, he froze. There was someone sitting in his chair. Pratt. Holmes's hand darted toward his cane sword, but Pratt lifted both hands. Slowly, warily. I came alone, he said. Lestrade stepped in behind Holmes, weapon drawn. We just saw a corpse with your sister's face in the river. Pratt's face tightened. That wasn't Rebecca. Holmes moved cautiously forward. You're certain? I saw her an hour ago. She gave me this. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter. Trembling slightly, Holmes took it. The seal was identical to the earlier wax mark, but the initials MMR had been struck through, and beneath it, 3 new characters scratched by hand in fading ink. T.S.D. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the page. It was written in Latin. A translation followed in English below it, hastily. Added, the codex is a map, not a book. The cipher was a gate, not a message. The access lies under the 3rd chamber. It must not be breached. The city was built above it to keep it buried. I am no longer with them. If you reach the chamber before they do, destroy what you find. Signed, R. Slade. Holmes lowered the letter slowly. She's still alive. Pratt nodded once. She faked her death. She needed to disappear completely. Whatever's under there, it's older than Mithras, older than Rome, and someone is trying to wake it up. Lestrade exhaled. So, what's the play now? Holmes turned toward the fire, lit a match, and dropped it onto the cold logs. Flame flared to life, casting long shadows behind them. We go down, he said. But this time, we don't go alone. The air in Baker Street was thick with the weight of revelation. Holmes stood motionless by the fireplace, the letter from Rebecca Slade still clutched in his hand. the flames reflecting in his eyes, but never touching the calculation behind them. Lestrade paced near the window, one hand on his revolver, the other rubbing his temple. Pratt sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, gaze locked on the floor, as though afraid that if he looked up, the truth might turn and face him directly. Holmes, however, was somewhere deeper in that quiet, internal space he only reached when all the noise of the case finally began to harmonize. Not resolve, but align. He moved suddenly, crossing to the mantel and picking up a small object, a book of matches. He turned it over slowly. "What was it she said?" he murmured aloud. "The Codex is a map, not a book." Pratt nodded. "That's what she wrote. The cipher was a gate." Holmes tapped the matchbook on the edge of his palm, as if coaxing a memory from its paper edge. "You told us she changed after Anatolia, became obsessed with ancient rites, lineages, hidden structures. But even obsession leaves fingerprints." Lestrade frowned. "You think she's still guiding this from the shadows?" "No," Holmes replied. "I think she's trying to undo something. But to do that, she had to bury herself behind the very symbols she once worshipped. And someone we've overlooked is trying to dig her truth back out, for reasons far more sinister." Holmes turned to Pratt. "You said she brought something back from Anatolia. A relic?" Pratt hesitated. "Yes, a small sculpture. A lion with a sun disk in its jaws, carved from obsidian. She said it matched carvings found under London. That was the first time I heard her mention the axis." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Where is it now?" "She gave it to Finch," Pratt said slowly. "She said he was the only one she trusted to hide it." Holmes straightened. "Then the pattern is complete." Lestrade looked up sharply. "What pattern?" Holmes gestured toward the papers on his desk. "The Codex, the scroll, the seal, the lion and sun. The convergence. Every clue we've followed has circled one constant symmetry. Rotational, mathematical, ritualistic. And what is symmetry?" Lestrade, if not repetition under control? He moved to the bookshelf and pulled down a copy of Roman Substructures of London. By Hargrove, a name Holmes had long suspected was more than coincidence. Inside, on page 127, a fold-out map revealed London's Roman-era foundations, temples, tunnels, aqueducts, all centered along the Thames. He laid the map on the table, placed a compass in the center of Ludgate Hill, and traced a perfect circle. Through for sights, the Blackfriars Crypt, the Charterhouse ruins, the submerged Mithraeum, and King's Reach. "The axis isn't a place," Holmes said softly. "It's a center point, a geometric lock." "And the Codex?" Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded to the letter. "It's the key, or rather, the instructions to the lock. But someone's been manipulating our search not just by hiding clues, but by presenting them in a specific order, a pattern designed to make us chase Rebecca, while the real player moved freely behind the scenes." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You mean Finch?" Holmes's gaze was ice. "No, not Finch." He stepped to the fireplace and picked up the envelope Slad's letter had arrived in. Turning it over, he slid a fingernail under the seam and peeled it open. A faint scent rose, not oil this time, but jasmine and pine. Holmes smiled thinly. Only one person in this entire case has moved through every layer without once being questioned. She catalogued the codex. She helped compile the facsimile. She claimed to be an academic, yet knew more about ritual geometry than even the Vatican. Transcripts. He looked at Lestrade. Hargrove. Pratt stiffened. What? But she's a colleague. She worked with Rebecca. She shadowed Rebecca. Holmes corrected. She watched her descent into secrecy and took note. She gained access to the codex's binding patterns. She suggested Pratt be put on leave, which gave her unrestricted access to the cipher long before any of us. Lestrade's eyes burned. But she's been in every room with us. She helped you reconstruct the annotations, and I tested her. Holmes said, I drew a false sigil on the scroll, a meaningless pattern. She claimed it matched ancient solar rites. No real scholar would have made such an assumption. Pratt whispered, then she was never after the codex. She was after what it leads to. Holmes nodded, and now she has the scroll, or at least what she believes is the final piece. Lestrade stared at the map. So where will she go? Holmes picked up a red pencil and circled the last point on the Roman convergence. St. Ethelwold's Chapel, beneath the Old Bailey. Lestrade blinked. That place has been sealed since the Blitz. Holmes smiled grimly, not to someone who already has the keys. They were out the door in minutes, a hired cab speeding through the quiet, rain-slick streets of London. As they passed the dome of St. Paul's and turned toward the shadows of the Central Criminal Court, Holmes sat perfectly still, fingertips pressed together. Symmetry, he repeated. Control. Lestrade glanced at him. What changed your mind? Holmes looked at him. It wasn't a clue. He held up the envelope again. It was the scent. Jasmine and pine. The same perfume I smelled on the fake scroll. The same perfume left on the copy delivered to Scotland Yard. He looked back toward the black shape of the Old Bailey looming ahead. The truth has been in front of us from the beginning. We were just reading it upside down. The cab screeched to a halt beneath the towering facade of the Old Bailey, the looming court building now shrouded in thick mist, and cut through only by the pale fingers of the gas lamps that bordered its entrance. Holmes stepped out first, trench, coat pulled tight against the damp wind, his eyes fixed not on the building above, but the wrought iron gate that guarded a sunken stairwell at the rear, a forgotten access point abandoned since the war, sealed off with rusted chains and an official marker long faded to illegibility. Lestrade followed, revolver drawn, as Pratt trailed behind, hunched with a mixture of dread and disbelief. If Hargrave's down there, he muttered, then she's after more than just knowledge. She is, Holmes said, his voice low and certain. She's after permanence. They descended quickly, the creaking stairs echoing beneath their steps. The rusted chains had already been cut. Holmes noted it with a glance, then moved ahead. Lantern in hand, the air grew cold and tight, the musty breath of stone and memory rising around them. They passed under vaulted ceilings, through doorways, with Latin inscriptions, each older than the last, and then, at the end of a narrow corridor, they reached it, the foundation of the old chapel. The stones were ancient, predating even the Norman invasion, and in the center of the chamber, half buried, beneath cracked mosaic, was a circular stone disc. Faded carvings radiated from it like a sunburst, each spoke etched with runes that pulsed faintly in the lantern's light. Beside it stood Amelia Hargrove. She turned slowly, her face calm, composed, and utterly devoid of surprise. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said, voice echoing in the chamber. Holmes stepped forward, eyes never leaving hers. "You took the scroll. You staged the false cipher. And you've misled this entire investigation since the start." "I did what was necessary," she said evenly. "Necessary?" Lestrade barked. "You murdered people. You manipulated Finch, lured Slade into exile, and nearly got Pratt killed." Her eyes flickered. "Finch was weak, Slade unstable, and Pratt, well, he was never the heir she believed him to be." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Heir?" Hargrove smiled faintly. "You still think this is about ancient codes and lost temples. But it's not. This is about continuity. The scroll doesn't just unlock a tomb, it unlocks heritage. The codex documents the bloodline of a forgotten order, one hidden beneath centuries of church and empire." She stepped toward the disc, her hands reverent. "Here lies the axis, not just a convergence of architecture but of lineage. The Mithraic priests believed in rebirth through blood. But the final chamber holds more than bones, it holds records, names, proof." Lestrade looked bewildered. "Proof of what?" Holmes answered, his voice hushed. "Of divine succession. She thinks she's descended from them." Hargrove turned, her expression aflame with quiet fervor. "Not thinks, knows. My family has protected fragments of the codex for generations. We were archivists, scribes, guardians, and then Rebecca got too close. She wanted to publish it, share it." Holmes took a slow step closer. "So you killed her?" "I tried to stop her," Hargrove said, "but she went underground, faked her death to run from me. From us. I warned Pratt to stay away. But then he made that facsimile, drew attention, forced my hand. I needed the scroll back. I needed to reach the axis first, before it was corrupted." Lestrade took aim, step away from the seal. But she didn't flinch. "You don't understand. The chamber below doesn't just contain names. It holds the rites, the final pages, the ritual that ensures the line is preserved." Holmes looked at her, truly looked. For all her cold logic and curated demeanor, he saw it now. Not hunger for power, not even belief in destiny. It was fear, fear of disappearance, fear of her history being lost, erased by time, and skepticism. "You didn't want to rule," Holmes said. "You wanted to belong, to prove that all your years of guarding secrets weren't in vain." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You've read the codex. You saw what the last lines implied. That only one of blood can open the axis. That the blood must touch stone." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you brought a blade." She didn't deny it. She stepped forward and drew a small ceremonial knife from her coat. Its edge curved, inscribed with the same sun lion symbol. Lestrade shouted, "Drop it!" But Holmes raised a hand. "No, Let her finish. Lestrade blinked. You want her to open it? Holmes didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the chamber floor. We need to know if what she believes is even possible. Hargrove knelt before the stone disk, murmured something in an old tongue, then nicked the edge of her palm. Blood fell in 3 soft drops onto the seal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint tremor rolled beneath their feet. The mosaic at the center of the disk shimmered, and a slow grinding began, the sound of stone shifting. Gears turning beneath centuries of dust. A seam opened, and the disk divided into 6 equal parts, retracting with a mechanical precision no one alive should have known existed. Below lay a shaft deep, dark, lined with stone steps winding down into a chamber untouched since Rome. Holmes stared. Breath shallow, Hargrove turned, eyes wide, triumphant. You see, it was real. All of it. But Holmes took no satisfaction in her vindication. What's down there? Lestrade asked, stunned. Holmes's voice was quiet, a truth buried because it couldn't be controlled. They moved cautiously down the spiral, lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls. At the bottom, they found a circular chamber with stone alcoves filled with tablets, urns, and at the center a sarcophagus carved with solar iconography. But it was the mural behind it that held Holmes's attention. A depiction of figures ascending from flame into light, each crowned not in gold, but in knowledge. The message wasn't about power, it was about remembrance. Hargrove approached the tablets with trembling hands. These are the rites, she breathed. But Holmes stopped her. You've proven the bloodline. You've revealed the chamber. Let that be enough. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she stepped back. Later, above ground, as Hargrove was taken into custody, she looked at Holmes once more, exhausted, somehow relieved. I only ever wanted the past to speak again. Holmes nodded, solemn. It just did. The wind had begun to rise over London by the time Holmes emerged from the depths. Beneath the Old Bailey, a storm was gathering not just above the city, but within it. News of the chamber's discovery had not yet reached the public, but Holmes knew that time was short. Truths that had slept for centuries had now tasted air, and there were still those who would do anything to keep them buried. Amelia Hargrove had been taken away quietly. No headlines, no cuffs, no spectacle, only the sound of distant footsteps as Lestrade led her into the yard's custody. Holmes had watched her go with the haunted understanding that the case, while no longer unsolved, was still unfinished, because one player remained unaccounted for, Merrick Adley, a name that had threaded through the story like a shadow, present in the background, silent during the theft of the scroll, ghost-like during the disappearance of Finch, and likely involved in the false body planted in the river. He was no zealot like Hargrove, nor a historian like Slade. He was something colder, a manipulator. Holmes suspected he had infiltrated the order under false pretenses, worming his way through archives, trusts, and even Vatican records, not to preserve the truth but to profit from it. And now he was the only one left in motion. By midnight, Holmes sat alone in 2-1B, staring at the final fragment of the codex, a torn slip of the scroll Rebecca had once marked with a single glyph. He'd found it lodged between the stones in the chapel floor, forgotten in Hargrave's rush. It meant nothing on its own, but Holmes knew it wasn't meant to dot, it was bait, which meant the end had to be played his way. He wrote to Notes 1 to Lestrade, instructing him to send a plainclothes officer to St. Pancras Freight Depot by 3 a.m. The second he left unsigned and addressed simply, "To the last heir." He placed the codex fragment inside and sealed it with wax dot at 2:47 a.m. He stood under the skeletal iron framework of the depot's western terminal, breath misting in the cold, lantern burning low beside him. The trains had long ceased operation here. The tracks were dust-covered and rusted, with broken glass glittering like frost. The silence was complete, until a step echoed across the far end of the station. Merrick Adley emerged from shadow in a long, grey coat. No disguise, no attempt at subtlety. Holmes watched him approach, the lantern between them casting both their shadows tall and warped along the floor. "You're cleverer than Hargrove," Holmes said. Adley smiled faintly. "I watched her unravel for years. She believed in destiny. I believe in leverage. You used her. I used everyone. Pratt, Finch, Slade. Hargrove opened the gate, but I made sure she never saw what lay beyond it. She thought she had purpose, but purpose is for the deluded." Holmes's tone didn't change. "You planted the false body Slade wanted. Out," Adley said. "She discovered the truth that the codex was incomplete, that it was a decoy meant to distract from the real archive buried under the chapel. So I let her go, but made it look like she hadn't. You were meant to mourn her and move on, but I didn't," Holmes said. "No," Adley admitted. "You don't follow grief. You dissect it." He stepped forward. "I know what you've done. You sent Lestrade to the yard, told him I'd try to intercept the codex fragment again." Holmes tilted his head. "And will you?" "I already did." Holmes's brow didn't twitch. "Then why are you here?" Adley grinned. "Because I wanted to see it. The endgame. I wanted to see you lose. You've caught the believers, the romantics, the fools. But me? I'm a survivor. I take the stories people bury, and I sell them back to the world with a price tag." Holmes stepped aside, gesturing to the lantern. "Then take it. The last piece. Sell your story." Adley approached, slowly, carefully. But when his hand reached for the lantern, Holmes spoke again softly, calmly. "You're under arrest." "Mr. Adley." The moment froze. Adley straightened, eyes narrowing. "No officers nearby," he said. "No sirens. You're bluffing." Holmes didn't move. "Did you know the depot's western wall carries sound like a theatre? A footstep there is louder here than beside me." Adley turned his head barely, and that was enough. From behind the crates at the far end, Lestrade and two constables emerged, pistols raised. "Don't," Lestrade warned. Adley looked back to Holmes. For a moment, the performance faltered. The chill of inevitability crept into his eyes. Then he lunged, but not for Holmes, for the lantern. He smashed it in one motion, glass shattered. Flame snuffed out, and something small slipped from his sleeve. A match, a vial. Holmes wasn't sure. A flash burst upward. Smoke. Sulphur. Cover. Lestrade shouted. But Holmes had already closed the distance, tackling Adley to the ground before the smoke could obscure him. They hit the floor hard, Holmes's cane jabbing against the man's ribs. Adley twisted, trying to reach into his coat, but Holmes struck again, harder this time, and the man stilled, breath heaving. When the smoke cleared, the codex fragment remained untouched on the floor, smudged but whole. Adley was dragged to his feet, blood on his lip, a sneer lingering beneath the pain. "You could have been rich," he spat. Holmes straightened. "You confuse wealth with meaning. That's why you lost." They stood there in the cold silence of the depot, shadows stretching once more into the distance. Behind them, the constables began to collect evidence. Lestrade lit a fresh lamp. Holmes said nothing at first. He watched the smoke rise, slow and ghost-like. Then he turned to Lestrade. "It's over." But even as he said it, he knew the codex would live on. The chamber beneath London would be sealed once more. The tablets returned to obscurity, the names unspoken. And yet, in a small way, justice had been served. Not because the secret had been silenced, but because it had been understood. The rain began just as dawn broke over London. A thin, steady drizzle that whispered against the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes sat in his chair, motionless, eyes on the fire, yet far away from the flickering glow. The codex fragment rested on the mantel beside a steaming cup of untouched tea. It was over, or so the official story would say. Amelia Hargrove had been charged. Merrick Adley was in a guarded cell beneath Scotland Yard. The ancient chamber beneath the Old Bailey had been sealed once more, its contents removed under supervision, and hidden deep within the British Museum's restricted archives. Lestrade had offered congratulations. Watson had insisted Holmes rest. But Holmes did not rest, because something small, something silent remained unspoken. It was late morning when the door opened without a knock. Rebecca Slade stepped inside. Holmes did not look up. He had been expecting her. She moved quietly, as if part of her had never returned from the catacombs. Her coat was damp, her face drawn, but her eyes sharp, alert, and cautious betrayed that she, too, had been turning over the final pieces of the puzzle. "I saw the papers," she said. "They've declared the case closed." Holmes nodded. "Once, so they have. And yet," she paused, eyeing the codex fragment, "you haven't let go." He finally turned to look at her. "You hid well, but you left too cleanly. That scroll fragment torn too neatly, placed too perfectly. You wanted someone to find it. I had to lead you to the access before they did." "I understand," Holmes said. "What I don't understand is why you let Hargrove take the fall." Rebecca's lips thinned. "She made her choices." "No," Holmes said, rising slowly. "She made your choices. You orchestrated the trail from the start. Hargrove believed she was racing you. Adley believed he was deceiving both of you. But you were always ahead." She looked away. "I did what I had to. You were never out of the game," Holmes said. "You just changed the board." He walked to the fireplace and retrieved A folded letter from behind the clock. No return address, no signature. Just this line, "Only the true heir can open the seal." You had sent that, not to warn me, but to tempt them. Rebecca's expression darkened. Adley would never have stopped unless he believed there was more. I gave him more. You baited him with the idea of the bloodline, the rights, the inheritance. You used Hargrave's obsession and Adley's greed to draw them both out. I had no choice, she said. Do you know what would have happened if that chamber had remained sealed and forgotten again? The codex would resurface a decade later, auctioned off to private collectors, misinterpreted, sold again. But this way, it's in the public trust, preserved, safe. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Safe? You killed a man in the process. You faked your own death. You let your brother believe you were gone. Rebecca's voice broke for the first time, and I would do it again. There was silence. The fire cracked softly. Holmes crossed to his desk, pulled open the drawer, and laid a file in front of her. You should see this. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page and stopped. What is this? A forensic analysis of the stone sarcophagus, Holmes said, conducted after your chamber was sealed. It showed faint traces of modern resin along the base. A hidden compartment had been opened recently before any of us entered it. Rebecca's breath caught. You opened it, Holmes said, long before Hargrave did. She didn't deny it. Holmes continued calmly. And what did you find? Rebecca stared down at the page, then closed the file. Names, she whispered. No rights, no inheritance. Just names, ours, mine, my grandfather's, Pratt, Hargrave, all traced to a secret society of Roman scribes. Not bloodlines, custodians. We weren't meant to rule anything. We were meant to protect the history. So, Holmes said, it was never about divine right. She shook her head. That's what I realized too late. The real power was never in blood. It was in control of knowledge. Hargrave died thinking she was chosen. But we were all just keepers of silence. Holmes walked to the window, watching the rain. You wanted to end the cycle, he said. That's why you planted the codex fragment and revealed the axis. But you also needed to vanish again because if the truth ever came out, they'd call me a liar, she finished. Or worse, a thief. Holmes turned back to her. So what now? Rebecca stood in the doorway, already pulling the hood of her coat up. Now I disappear. For real this time. You could stay, he offered. Almost softly, she smiled faintly. And what? Watch the world twist it into something it isn't. Let the headlines write their legends about Hargrave's cult and Adley's treason. No. You solved the case, Mr. Holmes. Let the rest believe it ended there. He watched her leave, the door swinging closed behind her. Moments later, Watson entered from the staircase, glancing at the rain and then the empty hearth. She was here, wasn't she? Holmes nodded, just long enough to say goodbye. Watson approached, then spotted the file on the table. So you did suspect her? From the moment I realized the scroll fragment didn't match the parchment of the original codex. It was newer, crafted, deliberate. Watson sighed. And now? Holmes looked at the fire. Now the story ends the way it must, with the truth too complex for anyone to believe. Watson hesitated, then smiled. But you know it, Holmes returned. The smile just barely. Knowing isn't always victory, old friend. Sometimes it's simply the burden of silence. And as the fire burned lower and the drizzle softened outside, Holmes sat down once more, folded his hands beneath his chin, and stared into the embers where memory, mystery, and meaning flickered, together in a dance only he would ever understand. The fire in Baker Street had long burned to embers, but Holmes had not moved. Watson, seated across from him, scribbled a few final notes into his leather-bound journal. Brow furrowed, a silence hung between them, not uncomfortable, but dense with thought. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the cobbles slick with the glisten of early morning. So, Watson said, breaking the hush. Rebecca Slade vanished again. This time, you let her go. I did, Holmes murmured. She manipulated everyone, Watson went on, voice edged with disbelief. Adley, Hargrove, even you. Holmes's gaze didn't waver. True. But unlike the others, she wasn't driven by greed or obsession. She acted out of obligation, twisted though it was. Watson leaned back, folding his hands. Still, she lied, hid evidence, faked her death. She orchestrated a theater, Holmes said calmly. But in doing so, she brought all the players onto one stage. Without her, we'd never have seen the full act unfold. He rose, paced once to the window, and looked out over the quiet city. You recall the librarian's body, or rather, the body believed to be hers, of course. But you said the dental records matched. They matched the files submitted, which were, as it turns out, falsified by Adley using a dentist who vanished from Soho 2 years ago. Likely bribed or blackmailed. A misdirection. And the poison, Watson asked, the rare compound used, extracted from a plant found in only one region of southern Italy. A clue meant to point toward old Roman rites. Hargrove believed it led to the bloodline key. But it was Rebecca's way of ensuring that both her rivals Hargrove and Adley focused on mythology instead of fact. Watson frowned, so she planted a corpse, tailored the forensic trail, and let them chase shadows. Precisely. That gave her time to access the true chamber well before anyone else knew it existed. Holmes returned to the armchair and rested his fingers beneath his chin. She knew there was no divine inheritance. The sarcophagus held no rite, no scroll of prophecy, just lists, ledgers of names, custodians, chosen not by blood but by secrecy. She could have gone public, Watson said, told the world. Holmes shook his head. She understood that to reveal it would be to destroy its meaning. The power of history lies not in who owns it, but in how it's remembered. And, Hargrove, she'll be tried, Holmes said. Likely declared unfit. Her obsession consumed her. But even now, she believes she was chosen. Watson's expression softened. Tragic. Yes, but deliberate. Holmes reached for a stack of documents from the table, and Adley will face justice, forgery, manipulation of evidence, conspiracy to conceal a body. His empire of secrets is crumbling. And Rebecca, Holmes smiled faintly. She's gone, but not lost. She left something behind. He opened a sealed envelope addressed to the keeper who chooses to forget. Inside was a single pressed flower mithras herb, the same used in the poison flattened and preserved beside a final fragment of the Codex. With one line in Latin, Watson read aloud, "Qui memoriam servit, veritatem create." He looked up. He who preserves memory creates truth. Holmes nodded. She understood that history is never fixed. It is built, piece by piece, by those willing to bear the weight of it. A silence followed. Finally, Watson spoke. "Do you ever wonder if justice was served? I mean, truly?" Holmes looked into the fading embers of the fire. Justice, Watson, is not always a matter of gavel and cell. Sometimes it is knowing the truth when no one else dares to see it. Sometimes it's letting the villain disappear not because they escaped punishment, but because their greatest sentence is living with what they've done. Watson closed his notebook. "And you?" Holmes offered a small, weary smile. "I will write no report, no declaration. Let Lestrade enjoy the credit. Let the headlines mourn the lost librarian and condemn the false heir. But somewhere, perhaps beneath a new name, Rebecca Slade will wake each morning and remember that she almost broke the world to preserve a story no one will ever read." And the Codex, filed in the British Museum, under restricted access, the true version. I made sure of that. It will gather dust, as it should, until someone is wise or foolish enough to seek it again. Watson rose, fastening his coat as sunlight finally pierced the clouds. "Then this case is truly closed." Holmes didn't answer. He simply nodded once, eyes fixed on the dying fire. As Watson left, Holmes remained still, the last words of the Codex fragment echoing in his mind, not a prophecy, nor a map, but a challenge. Truth is a shadow that only memory can cast, and Holmes, more than anyone, understood that some truths must remain in shadow known only to those who dared walk in its silence. The lamplight outside to 2-1B Baker Street flickered. In the light wind as Holmes leaned once more on the sill of his study window, watching the wet city come alive in the early evening. Carriages rattled across the glistening cobblestones below, their wheels echoing in rhythm with the ticking of the clock on the mantel. It had been hours since Watson had departed, and Holmes had remained as he was silent, still, reflective. The Codex was locked away, the villains were named, the curtain had fallen, and yet there was something very small, tucked between the lines of truth and memory, a whisper of a note, or the faint tug of a string not yet pulled. He turned back into the room. The fire was now only cinders, the heat fading. On the table lay a final scrap of paper, a journal page taken from Hargreaves' archives, one of the many that had been returned during the clean-up. Holmes had reviewed them all, every map, every translation, every scratched margin. All but this. He picked it up. One corner had been torn. The ink had faded where water had touched it, but a single line remained legible, scribbled in haste, almost an afterthought. He who walks backwards will see what others ignore. It was not a proverb Holmes recognized, not Latin, not Greek, not even belonging to any known riddle used by the Order of Custodians. He frowned. He retrieved Rebecca Slad's envelope, the one containing the pressed Mithras herb. Carefully, he removed the flower again, examining the way it had been folded. A crease at the bottom, an unusual one. He turned it over. A second. Message smaller, more cryptic, written in her hand. One chamber sealed, one still open. Holmes's breath caught. He sat, fast now, spreading the flower against the table. Examining the fibers, it was real. Not a code, not metaphor. Rebecca had left behind not closure, but an invitation. He rose quickly, scanning his bookshelf. In the far corner sat a volume rarely touched the underground structures of Roman Londinium. He pulled it free, laid it open to a bookmarked page. A diagram of the Old Bailey, overlaid on the ruins of an earlier structure, a temple whose foundation had once extended far beneath the city. The crypt Holmes had uncovered sat just beneath the main hall, but in the margin of the diagram was a second shaft unfinished, unreachable, recorded by an archaeologist in 1829 and forgotten by every hand since. One chamber sealed, one still open. She had known, not guessed known, which meant she had never intended this case to end. She'd orchestrated everything, every reveal, every betrayal, every supposed resolution, all to bring him here, not to finish the story, but to begin the next one. Holmes moved at once, retrieving his coat and cane. Crossing the flat swiftly, he opened the bureau drawer where he stored Watson's spare revolver and placed it in his pocket, more from instinct than expectation. At the door, he paused, his hand on the knob. Outside, the rain had returned, quiet, steady, persistent. He glanced once more at the table, where the herb and the final note rested. Then, with a faint smile beneath the edge of his collar, he whispered, curious, and stepped into the night. Beneath London, beneath the fog and the gaslight and the stone, an old silence waited. Whether it held truth, danger, or merely dust, Holmes could not yet say. But as the wheels of another mystery began to turn, he felt the unmistakable thrill, sharp and familiar, like the glint of steel in moonlight. Because though the case of the librarian had ended, something deeper stirred beneath it, a truth not yet told, a door not yet opened. And for Sherlock Holmes, the game, it seemed, was far from over.